What's up, guys? Welcome to the Fantasy Addiction Network. Today we are talking the Seattle Dragons XFL. We're looking at the XFL Fantasy Football 2020 player rankings and offensive breakdown for the Seattle Dragons. We're not going to waste any time. Let's get right into it. Alright, guys, so let's talk about the Seattle Dragons. This is a very interesting team to me. On paper, I want to believe that this would be one of the worst teams, but I feel like that's going to end up being a mistake. So looking first at their head coach, they have Jim Zorn in there. He spent most of his career as a quarterbacks coach. He did head coach the Washington Redskins for 2 years. The last time we really saw him coaching professional football, he was the quarterbacks coach for Kansas City, but that was all the way back in 2012. So he's been out of the game for a while. However, I do think that having a decent presence around the NFL is definitely going to help him in this regard, and we'll see what type of offense he likes to lead. I think this will end up being a little bit more of a defensive-minded team, but we'll see how that turns out. So let's look at the fantasy options here for the quarterback. So I think this is going to be one of the more controversial quarterback groups for fantasy going into it, because I've seen a lot of people that have criticized this group as being the weakest of the entire XFL. So you have Brandon Silvers and BJ Daniels. So looking at Brandon Silvers, a lot of people right now are giving him a lot of flack for not being a really good quarterback, but what we saw in the AAF, he looked really good, and I don't think that there's as much of a controversy here as is being spouted now. I think part of what is being thrown around is that there might be a quarterback by committee, which definitely could happen with BJ Daniels there. BJ Daniels is definitely more of your mobile quarterback, whereas Brandon Silvers is more of your pocket guy, and they've talked about potentially using both people in this offense. Now with the double forward pass role, I could definitely see this come into play. I'm hoping that BJ Daniels is more of like a gadget type player, someone a little bit more akin to like how the Saints are using Taysom Hill right now, versus more of like a 60-40 split. That would definitely eat into the fantasy value and targets of a guy like Brandon Silvers, and just overall prevent them from getting into a rhythm. But overall, I think that Silvers is getting a little bit more bad press than he should right now. I think if he ends up being the primary passer, he can definitely support fantasy value on his own and help the rest of the team around him. All right, well, let's go really quickly into the running backs, and let's start with a running back that the Dragons actually traded for, Kenneth Farrow. He was drafted in the second round and traded to the Dragons. So considering just the overall interesting quarterback situation, and we'll get into the wide receivers as well as to whether or not there's true alpha in the system, I would say that this is going to look to be more of a run-heavy team. And, considering that the Dragons traded for Farrow after already drafting a running back in the first round, I think that speaks a little bit more towards how much they want to split the carries between Farrow and Williams, who we get into in a second. But I think Farrow actually, just looking at his miserables, I think should actually shoulder more of a load. Farrow is incredibly athletic and, is decent in the passing game, but he does lack top end speed. So a little bit more of your traditional power back, but I think he will end up being a little bit more well-rounded than Williams. I think the main concern right now from fantasy is we really don't know that volume split. It might end up being more of a 50-50 committee, which is never fun, but both guys might have decent flex value in their own right. And then Trey Williams, the first running back that they actually drafted, he's the frame and speed of a scat back, so definitely a smaller back than Farrow, and I think he'll end up getting more receiving targets, but overall, I think Williams will end up, getting a lot of those carries vultured away from him, and there's, a decent number of guys behind Farrow and Williams that they might just end up running 3-4 running backs, and just making it really hard from a fantasy perspective to trust any of these guys going week in, week out. I do think if Kenneth Farrow were to miss any time, that Trey Williams would actually become a really good good play because he does have a good all-round skill set. But I think based on the fact that they traded for Pharaoh, it's looking like they're going to definitely include him in a committee, so it's going to make it murky to say the least about who will end up getting the most carries here. But anyway, real quick, if you guys are interested in playing fantasy football in the XFL, I have rankings for you. You can get them for absolutely free. Click the link in the description or go to fantasyaddictionnetwork.com if you want to access those. I will be updating them all off-season long. As news breaks, as players get traded, cut, we'll be updating those rankings for you guys, so make sure to check those out. Alright, well, let's get into the receivers. So here's where it gets a little bit more interesting. So we have a couple of decent names here, but not really any true alpha that stands out, at least to me. It's looking like their main receiver here will be Fred Ross. He was drafted in the 3rd round. He's 24 years old compared to their other receiver who I'll get into is a little bit older, but he has a very high speed score. I think that Fred Ross will, honestly, I think he has a lot more upside. I think Brandon Silvers has a decent deep ball, and Fred Ross should be able to play in the higher end of the field, and I think that he'll end up doing well there. So I think Fred Ross ends up being the more fantasy productive receiver on this team. And then the other receiver to really talk about is Kason Williams. So I think Williams will end up being the bigger and main target in the red zone and on those extra point plays, but he doesn't really offer much in the way of speed or burst metrics to really be excited about. So I think he ends up being like a okay flex play and probably someone on DFS that will have a few boom weeks just because of the ability to score multiple touchdowns, but not someone that you're going to want to rely on week in and week out, which is why I'm a little bit more inclined to go after Fred Ross. And then there's a little bit, in my opinion, there's a little bit more ambiguity as to who the 3rd, 4th, and the rest of the receivers will be. The guys I'm looking at right now during training camp to see who might break out would be Keenan Reynolds and Austin Proehl. So Keenan Reynolds and Austin Proehl, honestly, they have a very similar size, frame, and skill set. So I think they're both kind of competing for that slot role here in Seattle. We'll definitely have to pay attention to training camp to see who wins out because, like I said, these guys are very similar in terms of what we've seen up to this point. So it's just going to be a team chemistry fit and just seeing how these guys are still performing at this stage in their career. So as we know more information, we'll update our rankings more. But right now it's kind of a toss-up between Keenan Reynolds and Austin Proehl as to who I think will be the 3rd target in this offense. Jumping down to tight ends, they have tight end Evan Rodriguez. He was drafted in the 6th round. He's looking also to be one more like those boom bust type tight ends. Probably used a lot for blocking. Again, as I mentioned, this team is most likely going to be centered around running the ball, and having tight end like Evan Rodriguez there, I think will end up being a little bit more involved in the run game for as a blocking tight end. But I do think that he's going to get targets still. He's definitely athletic enough to be a target in the red zone, and kind of standard tight end where if he gets a touchdown and scores, you'll be happy that you started him, but I don't think his target volume is strong enough to warrant a high pick for him in fantasy. But anyway, again, speaking of high picks, rankings, again, just want to remind you guys, if you click the link in the description, you can access my rankings. Again, those are updated as I update them throughout the offseason, getting you guys ready as injuries, trades, waivers, cuts, and different things happen around the league. We will be making updates to those rankings so that way when it's time to draft for fantasy, you guys have the most up-to-date and accurate rankings as possible. So please feel free to download those. Again, absolutely free. And we thank you guys so much for coming and watching this video. We'll see you in the next one.